Well, hi everyone. We're so glad to have you here. Welcome to the 6th meeting of the Ask the Researcher Mpa Monitoring Series. My name is Lindsay. I'm with the Ocean Protection Council, and I am supported by a few other OPC folks, Tova and Elise. I'll be facilitating this webinar alongside Steve Wartz with CDFW and Rochelle with Strategic Earth, who is also part of the research team, so we might hear from her in that capacity as well. This webinar series was designed as an opportunity for interested members of the public to interact directly with researchers involved in California's Mpa long-term monitoring projects. Our goal in facilitating this 8-part series is to support broad understanding of the research that is informing the Mpa 2022 Decatal Management Review. Last fall, CDFW alongside OPC hosted 4 community meetings to inform the public about the Decatal Review and to hear perspectives and priorities on Mpa management. A consistent piece of feedback we heard was to let folks hear directly from researchers to help them better understand the science that is informing the review. So what we're going to do first is just walk through a few technical things with Zoom, walk through a couple meeting reminders, and then I'll turn it over to our researcher today. So if you haven't noticed already, this webinar is being recorded and closed captioned. If you have any technical difficulties viewing the screen or calling in, please email Rochelle at rochelle@strategicearth.com and send a message in the chat. When we're ready for the Q&A section, you can unmute yourself when we ask you to and raise your hand if possible, or press *6 if you're joining via phone when it's your turn. One thing we ask you to do is if you're joining us today on Zoom, I'm not sure if you can do this on your phone, but go ahead and change your name so we can identify you and you can see other participants. So to do that, you want to click participants in the meeting controls, find your name and click more and choose rename. Please enter your full name and an identifier if possible. If you want to have this meeting with closed captioning, go ahead and click CC in the meeting controls. So some meeting agreements. First, we ask that everybody be respectful of others. Please put yourself on mute when you're not speaking. Please listen for understanding and acknowledge and seek clarification of others' perspectives. Please openly discuss issues with others who hold diverse views and approach discussions from a place of diversity and inclusion. Please keep your comments concise and focus on the topic at hand today. And as a reminder, personal attacks and offensive language will not be tolerated. If you have any issues, please connect with the facilitators or agencies to talk through questions or concerns. We ask that everybody abide by these agreements. If you're unable to, we'll invite you to leave today's meeting and watch the recording at a later date. The recording should be posted in the coming days. You're also encouraged to email your input to CDFW at the address that's dropped in the chat. So with that, I'm very excited that Dr. John Bukowski from EcoTrust is here with us today, and he'll give us a brief presentation of his work establishing a statewide baseline and long-term monitoring Mpa monitoring program for commercial and commercial passenger fishing vessel fisheries. After the presentation, we'll have time to hear questions from the audience. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Bukowski.
I am muted. Good evening, everyone. Thank you. I am not a doctor. Thank you for that upgrade there, Lindsay. I appreciate the confidence in my work and my team, but I do not have a PhD, just to clarify for the record. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Received the promotion already. This is great. Well, thank you very much, Lindsay. Thanks, OPC and the Department of CDFW for hosting these. I think these are an excellent opportunity for folks to learn more about work we're doing that was done on their behalf, really understanding marine protected areas in California. As Lindsay said, I'm John Bukowski. I work with EcoTrust. I'm the Knowledge Systems Program Director there. I worked with a team of folks from Cal Poly Humboldt and Strategic Earth Consulting to conduct this project in 2019 to 2021, and the intent was to inform the Marine Protected Area Monitoring Program, including the state's 10-year management review. Our study was conducted by researchers from Cal Poly Humboldt, EcoTrust and Strategic Earth Consulting, as I said, and this project assessed the socioeconomic conditions of commercial and Cpfv fisheries throughout the state of California. My goal tonight is to share with you our final reporting products and provide to you an overview of the project. So I'll be giving an overview. I'm going to be sharing some of the key findings and recommendations, and I'll share project resources and hopefully answer any questions that might come up. So really to start from the top, I think, why do we study the human dimensions of marine protected areas? I think often we consider marine protected areas a natural resource management tool. But in reality, they're, in my mind at least, they're a human management tool. When you stop and think about it, what are these marine areas being protected from? I think ultimately that question can go in many directions, but humans is a part of that, definitely part of that equation. So as resource managers, the state has very little control over things like the size and area of corals or the number of rock piles. They can't do much about the size of fish. But what they can do are regulate human movement. They can change human behavior. And I think, so if you think of it from that perspective, what are MPAs if not really a human management tool? And consider me biased, but I think that human dimensions of MPAs is really the most vital aspect of understanding MPA management review. It affects our communities, it affects our fellow human beings who experience the outcomes of MPAs. And I think in this context, we can think of outcomes as a combination of both negative and positive impacts from MPAs, as well as the broader economic and cultural, political aspects of each of these communities. But the question remains, so how do you go about this? What do you do to understand the human dimensions of MPAs? Well, we know from past research that MPAs can have social and cultural and economic outcomes for individuals and communities who depend on marine resources and spaces. And we know that those who study human dimensions of MPAs can view the perceptions as an acceptable and credible measure for understanding the legitimacy and the acceptability of MPAs. And so our project was focused on trying to create that kind of study in a long-term effort here in California. We were really focused in our project on research that highlights the importance of understanding the broader socioeconomic context and understanding what the impacts are in the overall health and well-being of connected fishing communities. We also wanted to contribute to a better understanding of use patterns with our project and provide a better way of understanding how to put in place more the adaptive management aspect. So to conduct this work, we engaged, we broke our project up into 4 major components. Engagement. The idea here was we wanted to engage representatives of the commercial fishing community so that they could participate as partners in the long-term socioeconomic monitoring effort. We also engaged managers, agency staff, and researchers in our study design and our findings. We conducted focus groups to understand the perception of the fishing community, to understand better what they think the well-being of their port and communities and the outcomes from the management of MPAs. We developed and conducted spatial and economic data analyses as well as a third component of our project. And finally, we developed a set of recommendations for our work based on what we heard during our project. So going through each of the components, again, the first component being engagement. Again, the idea behind this was to represent or work with fishing communities so that they could participate as partners in this long-term effort. This is a good overview, I think, of our engagement process. You can see up here at the top that we have engaged the fishing community throughout the project, throughout the whole study. And then in our study design phase, we engaged the fishing community along with agency staff and the academic folks. In the implementation phase, we were engaged with the fishing community. In our final product development, we re-engaged with academics and agency staff. And then we engaged the public in our final development of our product. Moving on to the focus group perceptions component of our project. Here's a nice picture of some of the folks who participated in our very first focus group. Again, the idea behind this was to, our aim here was to assess commercial and Cpfv fishing community perceptions of well-being of their port fishing communities. And we wanted to hear about the outcomes from management of MPAs, including how fishermen have been affected by and or adapted to MPA implementation over time. We designed our focus group approach to hear directly from California's commercial and Cpfv fishing communities. And we really focused in on 3 core questions. We wanted to understand how commercial fishermen and Cpfv owner operators perceived well-being in their port and region, especially along environmental, economic, and social factors. We wanted to understand also commercial fishermen and Cpfv perceptions of the MPA implementation, especially as they affect environmental, economic, and social outcomes. And then finally, we were looking at what connections between connections between the perceptions of well-being and outcomes for commercial and Cpfv fishermen. Both our data collection, in our data collection process through this, we really focused on making sure we collected both quantitative and qualitative data. All focus groups were held over Zoom due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And here you can see that we had 18 commercial fishing focus groups across the state. There were a total of 85 participants. Each of them, that was held between July 2020 and March 2021, and they were about 3 to 4 hours apiece. For the Cpfv folks, we had 5 regional groupings. They were conducted between September 2020 and March 2021. They were about 2.5 to 4 hours long, and we had about 20 participants contribute information. Each focus group followed the same structure where we first asked participants to rate their fishing community on a 5-point Likert scale on a set of 3 questions. We then showed those ratings and asked participants to discuss them to introduce context to the quantitative data. We also encouraged them to think about beyond their individual perspectives and rate and discuss the broad experience of fishermen in their ports, so that we asked them to think largely about and represent larger aspects of their port. After about 10 minutes of discussion, the participants re-rated the same set of questions, and we repeated this process across all the focus group questions. The questions covered environmental, economic, and social aspects of community well-being, as well as livelihood, ecological, and management outcomes from MPA network. The overall takeaways, we learned that both commercial and Cpfv fishing communities indicated they were experiencing challenges in their environmental and economic social well-being. A majority of the participants expressed negative views across ecological, livelihood, and management outcomes of the MPA network, with dissatisfaction often stemming from a perceived lack of clear goals and communication of those goals, as well as a lack of opportunities for inclusion of fishermen knowledge and participation in MPA processes. Finally, results suggested that while the MPA network was not the only cause of well-being challenges identified in the focus groups, the MPAs had interacted with and in many cases exacerbated pre-existing well-being conditions. Moving on to the spatial and data exploration work we did with economic data, this component of our project. Our study was to develop, this part of the study, we wanted to develop modeled spatial layers which provide annual summary of pounds landed by commercial fishing in a comparative scale. And what I mean by that, you can see here the fisheries, this is what fisheries data are collected in currently. This is a 10 by 10 nautical mile area, 100 square mile nautical area. This is how data are collected currently. This map, as you can see with the MPAs overlaid, is not a great scale in comparison, so it's hard to have comparative studies. especially when you think about the other ecological data that's collected and other information that's collected is collected at this scale, the 1 by 1 nautical mile scale. So if we go back and forth, you can see sort of the difference in size of these grids and how these data are collected. So it's important to have the human use data, the fishing, commercial fishing data at a similar ratio scale to have comparative analysis. And so how do we do that? Well, we did have one thing we used, which was pre-MPA data that was collected by EcoTrust in a pre-MPA implementation phase. These data are collected through one-on-one interviews with fishermen. They're highly precise, but pretty intensive interviews. And so the information that is collected here is of high value and high quality, but it was done at a snapshot in time, and it was done in a process that's not very repeatable for a long-term monitoring process. We need to continuously collect data over long periods of time, and this is a very intensive process for both the researchers as well as the fishing community. It takes a lot of effort on the fishing community's part to participate in something like this. So this isn't really a reasonable thing to consider for a long-term monitoring process. But we did have it in our available to us, and using this, we were able to create a statistical refactoring value that we applied to this level of the grid, the 1 by 1 nautical mile grid, creating a refactoring value so that we could multiply that value by the larger 10 by 10 grid, and we could constrain within the larger 10 by 10 area where they fish using the EcoTrust data. So this was really a constraining, like a modeling effort here to create data that could be used then to look at year after year the pounds landed by fishery and in what region. So when you apply this then to, this is for California sheephead, you can see how it refines the data to these smaller 1 by 1 nautical mile areas. And then if we look at a 2005 data set for the same thing, California sheephead, we can scroll through time and you can see how the map adjusts, and you can see the data that was combined here, the EcoTrust data and the landings data provides us a better understanding of the use patterns in and around the MPAs through time. We did find this to be a useful exercise. We appreciated the effort and the exercise. It was really challenging but fun to sort of explore. We do think that it's an appropriate and good use of these data. However, we really would recommend for the future that the data are collected at a finer scale. There are ways to do that, and I believe that those data would benefit everybody to be collected at a better, finer scale. Moving on to our project recommendations component. Really, again, we wanted to produce a set of recommendations for MPA monitoring, the socioeconomic aspects of MPA monitoring that included California's fishing communities. And so that's what these are focused on. And our initial recommendation is to explicitly identify and provide sustained funding for full spectrum of human dimensions research, including long-term socioeconomic monitoring program for commercial and Cpfv fisheries. We believe it's also important to establish better, finer scale methods of spatial and temporal data collection. And we also want to see integrate collaboration across human and ecological dimensions. We recommend that that would be a good way of moving that forward. Building out communication channels that are reflective of the needs of target audience. This is an inclusive and adaptive to audience needs, two-way information exchange, co-creation of processes and products, something that addresses inequity and burnout, especially from participating fishermen. And then neutral facilitation is a big aspect of this. Having neutral facilitation is a big part of this recommendation too. Being accountable and transparent about opportunities for adaptive management and potential expansion of protected areas. This is a really important topic now, and we highly recommend that there's be more consistent and timely messaging, perhaps forming fishermen advisory bodies and or a body, and then opportunities for fishermen to collaborate in long-term monitoring and research. And then our final recommendation is that that there'll be investment in California fishing community well-being. We heard a lot about the factors of well-being in these focus group meetings, and well-being, as we said, was affected and exasperated by MPAs, but well-being overall is in need of being improved for a lot of these communities. So in terms of final products and available, where they are available, there is a final report that you can access through our website, which I'll share in a moment. The report has all of the finer details of our study, the key findings across all the focus groups, and more information about the data and the spatial data analysis. But a great place for any kind of further diving is through our website. We really, from the beginning, wanted to make sure we provided a very digestible information in as broad an audience as possible. So we formed a website early on, and we tracked our progress through it, and then it was part of our final deliverables. You can find it here at mpahumanyuses.com. I'll click on that, and you can take a look here. This is what the website looks like. It really well lays out all of the work we did, provides you with a great overview of the project. You can find more about our key findings here. There are 8 major key findings, which you can dive into and learn more about each of those here. You can also look at the commercial focus group outputs. So all 18 commercial fishing ports, these reports are summarized here. You can click on it and learn more about specific port information, how many people participated, when that discussion occurred. You can find out the overall well-being, the strengths and challenges in each community. And then you can see how each community was compared against each other in terms of how they perceived well-being within each of these ports. So this is for all of them. Again, Eureka here coming in at 2.1. You can find out more about what the participants thought of MPAs and the takeaways from those conversations. And then you can read quotes directly from fishermen who participated in this focus group in Eureka. Scrolling back to the top, you can also explore, again, all of our key findings. We can look, here you can see all 8 of them, including impact or effects from specific MPAs. You can click on this and you can see in here what how each focus group reported what they had to say about every MPA across California, and for Cpfv fishermen, owner operators. You can explore the map where you can learn more about the spatial data that we created. You can see which fisheries we created the data for. It's overlaid with the MPAs. You can switch between layers, and then you can also slide through time and see how the data changes over time. You can click on the layer and learn the number of estimated pounds based on the modeling we did, and then you can click into the report that provides an overview of how we created these data sets. We have a fisheries data explorer that's in a more tabular form, so it's very similar, or it's information that summarizes across all of the ports. You can see the commercial or Cpfv fishing. You can click down and learn about each individual port, see how things adjust over time, learn about the top fisheries, that kind of thing. That's available for here, in this format for now. There will be a version coming out from the Department of Fish and Wildlife soon that will replace this version, but this is available for users at this moment. There's also a resources page where you can just dive deeply into all the things available about this project, all the prep packets, learn all the details, including looking at our executive summary, which is downloadable here as a PDF, provides a great overview of the project. And finally, you can take a look at our full report. You'll bring up this PDF here. You can read the entire thing, all 133 pages of fun, and learn a lot more about what we got up to. And I just want to take this moment now to also really express my gratitude for all of the participants in our study. I think the commercial fishermen and the Cpfv owner operators were tremendous in the efforts they put into this, and I also want to really express gratitude to our team. Just a wonderful dream team of folks, loved working with everybody, and really enjoyed this project quite a lot, learned a lot as well. So I just want to say thank you to everyone. And then thank you to the audience as well. And I'm looking forward to answering any questions. I will stop sharing.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, John, for that presentation. There's a lot of great information in there. Before we move on to Q&A, I just want to point the audience to some of the links that Rochelle has shared in the chat. So she's dropped a link to the full report that John and his team have prepared, as well as a snapshot report. It's a 2-page overview of some key findings, not all of them. And then also a link to the Mpa Human Uses website that John just walked us through. So with that, if anybody has any questions, feel free to raise your hand or drop it in the chat, and then I'll moderate from there. So we've got a couple questions. The first one is in the chat from Anupa. How did you manage for focus group bias? Also, how did you address potential bias in your recruitment methods?
That is a wonderful question. And I am going to invite my colleague, Rochelle, who also participated, to maybe help us answer that question. Rochelle, do you have a better sense of how we worked on that?
Yeah, so thanks, John. And yes, taking off my hat, I'm here supporting the technical side of this webinar, and yes, was one of the members of the project team for this project. There inherently is some bias because it's, the folks who showed up who are available are the ones that we were able to speak to. And so if you saw that there were some ports where we were missing data because there were some folks that in those ports that did not feel comfortable participating. And so, the recruitment process was very much based on, sorry, small person, yes, little child home from school, yes. She's asking for candy. The answer is yes. So the recruitment process was very much based on who was available and who could show up. And as John said, our team has done focus groups within ports for many years, but because of the COVID-19 pandemic, it was also dependent on, who could join via a computer. And a lot of, there were some cases where folks buddied up on a computer, but yeah, we had to definitely change our approach there.
Thanks, Rochelle. Appreciate that.
Thanks, Rochelle. It looks like Dig Og has his hand raised. Dick, want to unmute yourself?
Hi, Lindsay, and Rochelle and John. Thank you very much. That was a great presentation. You have to forgive my dogs, and I'm trying to back out of the slip as we speak. So I'm multitasking.
Yeah.
The bias issue is one that is really, somewhat problematic. I mean, it's very difficult for a lot of the guys to be able to get on a computer and be available at the time that they need to be. So that is something that's kind of has been on my mind also. One of the things that I wanted to bring up real quick or ask about, and it's more so regarding future regulations within MPAs. Has there been any thought about the ability for the fishermen to be able to travel through the MPAs? And I mean, this might not be something I should be asking at this point, but I mean, to follow pelagic species. In other words, ones that are not stationary in those MPAs. Has there been any thought as to the allowing access, to be able to do that? Like in particular, I'm thinking about salmon.
Yeah, that's a great question, Dick, and thanks. I would invite maybe Steve Wirtz to jump in and help us answer that. But I would say first, I agree. I think the question about bias and recruitment to participating is something that we recommend through maybe forming an advisory body. And that advisory body could help, kind of reduce some of the bias and or get broader participation. So I think there's some thought to put to that. And then Steve, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the pass-through idea.
And John, just building on that too, there was also in our recommendations, the need to build trust and relationship building, because some folks were not interested in participating because they felt that they had been burned in the past. And so for folks to continue to engage in these types of processes, there needs to be some bridges built. Sorry, Steve.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks a lot, Dick, for that question. I'm not sure about your area specifically, but some of the MPAs, when they were designed, state marine conservation areas prohibited, all types of take except for salmon trawling, to allow a fisherman to fish through there, because you're trawling, you're in the upper water column, and there's little likelihood that your gear is going to interact with anything on the bottom. So we did take that into account in the planning, but that can be a recommendation to the Fish and Game Commission as we move forward to the 2022 or at the end of December, and we got our report together and meet with the commission in February of 2023. That could be a recommendation, and you could send it to our email address that we had brought up earlier, and we'll bring it up again during this webinar, and we can add that to our running list. But we have experimented with that, and I think there could be some more investigations into it where you're not compromising the habitat because you are up in the upper water column, and maybe we need to look at those MPAs that does allow that type of activity, take a deep dive into it and see how it is performing, and to see if that type of fishery does have an impact or not. So, but that's a really good recommendation for us to take to the commission to consider.
Steve, thank you very, very much. That's something that has bothered a lot of the guys in our area. And I really, truly appreciate, your thoughts on that. And I also wanted to say thank you to Rochelle and Kelly for, making this as safe as possible for, for all the guys that were interested in participating. I really sincerely think that everybody felt good and weren't threatened in any way, and they certainly set that up very, very well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dick, for that question, and the whole team for replying with Steve. With that, I might just jump to Mpa had a clarifying comment in the chat. So they were asking more about the focus group bias and within the group itself. The question is how comfortable folks may have felt in sharing their opinions within that focus group.
Yeah, so ultimately, and Dick and others on the call that I'm seeing, George and others who, I don't know, I don't remember, George, if you were on it, but Dick was on these focus groups, can speak to that as well. But I mean, they all know each other already, and these focus groups were report specific. So I think that helped with folks' comfort level in speaking up. Kelly and I knew a lot of these folks from the beginning because of previous work that we've done with a lot of folks. We made sure that, when there were questions asked, that the resources were available when we could, and directed folks in the direction of their answers when there were answers available. But also too, John mentioned that there was a different kind of scoring that we used, where we invited folks to score a question up front, and then we allowed them to talk about it for a little bit. And it was really fascinating to see, because then we scored again, and their scoring changed based on the conversation. And folks generally, because they had the option to decide if they wanted to be anonymous in the reporting or not, folks tended to be pretty relaxed in the conversation. John, anything to add there? And you're on mute.
Yeah, no, thanks, Rochelle. I think that's right. I think that was what we understood, and from those and the change between the two question periods was interesting. But yes, I appreciate the answer. Thank you.
Maybe we should keep Rochelle on the line for one more second. Ellie Jones had a question. How do you build trust, Rochelle, and what tactics worked and which didn't?
Well, I can tell you that trust is not built overnight. It takes years and years. As I mentioned, Kelly and I knew a lot of these individuals for many years before we started this project. And so, and like I said, when folks, asked questions, we were open and honest about when we had the answers, and very open and honest when we didn't, because there are a lot of things that we don't have the answers to. And, some of those, the questions like Dick just asked about the thoughts about the ability of fishermen to travel through MPAs. We have to be very honest about, we can't answer that, but we can direct you to the department who can. So yeah, it's a long-term process with lots of dot connecting.
Thank you for that. I'm going to jump to George's question in the chat here, unless there's a hand raised that I'm not seeing. No. George asks, is there data on how the MPA network is performing? Is it as a whole achieving the attendant goal? And on a more finer scale, is the MPAs in his neck of the woods in Northern California performing in the need for implementation? He has a note. He asked these questions during the last process, and the answers he received were each MPA had its own internal goal separate from the MPA network. So I imagine we'll have Steve, or I'm happy to chime in as well to help with this question. But if John or Rochelle, you have any input, we'd love to hear it.
No, I guess this is more the NC's process that's in play or going on currently, kind of looking across all of the reports that were collected and trying to understand. So yes, I would love to hear more about that myself.
Sure. Steve, do you want to chime in, or do you want me to start?
Yeah, go ahead if you want to take a stab at that.
Sure. That's a great question, George. So right now, the department is preparing a report that's evaluating how the MPA network is meeting the goals of the MLPA. So it's taking in tons of information, and I won't dig too deep into this because Steve is going to do a great job after the Q&A session talking about all the different kinds of data that are going into the report, but know that it will be speaking on progress towards meeting the goals of the MLPA. Do you have anything you wanted to add, Steve, or should we move on to the next question?
Let's move on to the next question when we come back, because my computer froze and I didn't really hear everything that was said. So that's why I punted to you. So let me just take a look at this one. And
sure, no problem. Let's see. So Mpa has another question, and then I can go back to Ellie's first or second question. How did you manage input on MPA views versus environmental changes that may have actually been a result of climate change impacts, like the marine heat wave? Great question.
Yeah, so the questions we asked tried to get at all of those factors. We tried to understand both direct effects of MPAs, but also the environmental conditions. So a series of questions that we asked tried to differentiate and kind of distinguish between those various components, and that was the aim of those larger questions we put together. Rochelle, did you have more specifics on that?
I think that's great. Yeah, I mean, the questions were kind of split up into two sections. One was specific to MPA effects, and one was specific to other things. I mean, there were questions about job satisfaction that aren't necessarily related to MPAs, but could be. And so trying to tease out those effects with those questions, and hence why there's a lot of qualitative data to accompany the quantitative data. And sorry, to circle back, sorry, I had another thought to circle back on the question about trust building. These webinars were, the fact that they're happening, were shared with the focus group participants, even though the project is over, and we will be sharing these recordings with them afterwards as well.
Thanks, Michelle and John. I see Steve, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I'm looking at the question with where the cursor's at. And during the planning process to design the network, there was a wide range of people involved. There were commercial fishermen, recreational fishermen, NGOs, representatives from academic institutions, a broad range. And they were all put together to help design the network. They were forced to get in groups where they weren't maybe so compatible with each other because they have a different frame of mind or interest. But that's what actually resulted in the end in the network of marine protected areas. The department, through a science advisory team, provided the science guidelines, but stakeholders, fishermen, designed them. So they were involved in the process from the very beginning. And that's where John got some of his data he spoke about earlier, where when we started the planning, they'd asked the fishermen, basically they gave them 100 pennies, I believe, and they said, hey, put these pennies where you think are the most important areas for you. And some fishermen, the way I understand it, might put all 100 or whatever it was on one spot, or they might have spaced them out. And so during the planning process, when they got in this group with the other stakeholders looked at these charts that were those heat maps that John showed, and they said, there may be a similar habitat where it's bright red. And so can you put the Mpa over here instead of at this part of the coastline, because for whatever reason it's close to port or it's a productive spot for the fishermen. So, excuse me, there was a very interactive and engaged process with fishermen during the planning process. And we at the state are always looking forward for ways when we do, especially working with OPC, with grants to get the fishing community engaged, but it does require fishermen to be communicating with scientists to come up with ideas and support, their idea, to get support for it and participate actively.
Thanks, Steve. I might call on Jamie. I see a hand is raised. You can go ahead and mute yourself.
Hi, Jamie Diamond, Stardust Sport Fishing out of Santa Barbara. So I am in a unique position that my husband and myself have been involved since literally the very beginning, since the planning process began, since those meetings Steve was mentioning. And I would just caution using the phrase fishermen help design very cautiously, just because it wasn't so much like we were like, yes, let's put it here. It was more so like, well, what's the least worst? And there's a big difference in what those two things are. My husband was on the Blue Ribbon Task Force and all those different pieces of the puzzle along the way. And I'd say where we are today with the department, with NOAA, our relationships with fisheries managers is a much different place than we were back then, for sure. 100%. There's way better communication and trust that has been built over time. However, there is a small percentage of us that are doing the majority of the lift and the work now, because it took so much out of so many. They just don't have the stomach to participate anymore. And so we are spread relatively thin. We do well, but we're between commercial and I'm specific to Cpfv. We do well, but we are maxed out on committees and work groups between the state and federal and groundfish and highly migratory and tuna and all the different things that are out there that we have to keep an eye on, plus the California Air Resources Board, plus Coast Guard, plus this, plus that. It's so much that we are having to have our head on a swivel with. And in my area specifically, we have some of the most MPAs in the Santa Barbara Ventura region, coastal and at the islands. And so it's particularly difficult for us. And so the quality of life aspect of this was huge. We had a lot of people who lost their businesses. And so, yeah, it's just, it's kind of crazy. And I really appreciate that you are taking a look at the fisher person as a whole person from that aspect, because it really is important. There's a huge mental and socio aspect to this that has been missing for a long time. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. We really appreciate that. And I think a lot of the recommendations we have at the end of our report, starting on about page 115 or so of the full report, address a lot of the concerns. And we heard a lot of what you're expressing here in our focus groups. And I think we've recommended for the long-term monitoring, hopefully ways to address some of that, especially the burnout and the trust building. I think those are really important elements of any long-term socioeconomic monitoring that might occur. So love to hear your input on those recommendations if you get a chance to take a look at them in the full report at whatever point. And Rochelle, please, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, it's okay. I was just going to say that she did a beautiful job of also answering this question from Ellie about using what we learned from these surveys. How do you think fishers might be involved earlier in future MPA designation efforts instead of involving them in these monitoring processes after MPAs have already been created? And Jamie, as Jamie said, there are a lot fewer folks participating, but there will always be fishermen at the table because they know that they need to be, or fishing and members of the fishing community because they know that they need to be, but there will be a smaller group because they're flat out. They're being asked, as Jamie said, for support, for input on wind, 30 by 30, oil platform decommissioning, like you name it. It has to do with the ocean, and the fishing community is engaged. And so they will continue to be engaged, but at what level, I think the expectations need to change from the MLPA initiative process.
Thanks for that comment, Jamie, and all the follow-up, Rochelle and John. We're always open for recommendations on how best to engage, and recognizing that there's just so much going on at one time. So we welcome further conversation about this. Looking to the chat, I don't see any hands raised at the moment. Cindy had asked, who's preparing the Decatal Management Review Report? I'll just quickly state that that's CDFW, and we'll save the rest of your questions for Steve's presentation in a few moments. He'll cover all of your questions in his slides. And then the next question I see in the chat is from Caitlin Gaffney. So perhaps Rochelle, you can speak to this one a little bit about the outreach for the webinar series, and then I'm happy to follow up, but you are.
Yeah, no, so we have an email list with all the focus group participants, and they were all made aware of this webinar. It was all of the Ask the Researcher webinars. It was one of the ways that we tried to advertise these things, of course, through the department's channels and OPC's channels, but also reaching out through these focus groups, through the Dungeon Scrap Task Force email list, all these different places. So they have been made aware, and we are going to follow up with them once these are complete with the recordings. And that is part of that trust building and trust, maintaining those relationships and maintaining that trust. Again, even though the project is over, that doesn't mean that our relationships are by the wayside. We will continue to share the resources as they're available to us.
Thanks, Rochelle. And I'll add that, we've asked all of our partners to amplify this. We were lucky to have CCFRP be our webinar on Monday. And so they were able to push the webinar series through their channels as well. And as Rochelle said, these are all being recorded. All of our past webinars are available on OPC's website. So we'll drop those links again throughout this webinar as well to make sure people have access to that. And we'll push that again moving forward to make sure everybody knows about these webinars. It's a really great opportunity. Okay, I'll stop talking. We have a few things coming in the chat now as well. Let's see. Jamie had a comment, so I can just read that out loud. Many just don't have time. Many are on the water working. Some, oh gosh, I can't read the whole thing right now. Oh, here. Some may watch the recordings. Some are just done. Appreciate that. we want to do the best we can to make things available, and hopefully they are used and understand that people are burnt out. Let's see. I have one from Hayden Vega. What were your strategies for minimizing burnout while you were working with your focus groups?
Would you like support there, John?
Yes, thanks.
There's no way to minimize it, especially when you're asking for a 4-hour conversation in the evenings. Part of it was working around them. I mean, there were times, focus groups were some in the evenings, most in the evenings, actually, from 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. Everybody's exhausted, they're eating dinner during the focus groups. But also too, and this is part of the respect or the trust building as well, we paid participants for their time. They received a stipend, I think it was $150, nothing absorbent, but something so that they knew that we respected their time and their effort and their energies. It's not enough to replace a day on the water. It's not enough to replace 4 hours worth of work, but something to show that we respect their time. And so they were able to prioritize that a little bit differently. And I think it helped. I hope it helped. And some folks, gave it to their local fishing association. There was one person who bought a computer, used it to help buy himself a computer because he realized through this process that he needed a new one. So yeah, those were some little bits that we used to help minimize burnout.
Thanks, Rochelle. Elise had a question. Let's see, why do you think there was such a difference in the participant numbers? 85 were in the focus groups for commercial and 20 for Cpfv.
Yeah, I think part of that was our approach. We focused in on a port level for commercial fishermen, and we worked at a regional level for Cpfv. I think just in general too, in those two populations, there are many more commercial fishermen than Cpfv operators. So I think it's just a balance of those two. I think we would have loved to have seen more participation, perhaps, but the realities of conducting this project through a pandemic in a virtual setting, knowing again the conversation we just had about burnout that Jamie brought up, this seems like actually a pretty reasonable number of participants, especially on the per port or per regional level basis. So, yeah, I think that those really are the reasons why there was a difference.
And really, when you look at some of the reasons why we had to do it regionally, especially when you move up north, we had to have a minimum sample size of 3 per focus group so that we could keep folks anonymous and keep the data robust and anonymous. And in some ports, especially up north, there's not 3. They don't call themselves Cpfvs up there. They're 6 packs or party boats or charter vessels. There's not 3 in some ports. So we had to group some of them together for that reason. There's just a large population difference.
Fantastic. Thanks for walking us through that. Just a quick time check. If there's one last question, I'll take that. Otherwise, we'll start wrapping it up with Steve's presentation. Okay, I might ask one quick question. Could you touch on, since the focus groups occurred during COVID, could you speak to some of the impacts that you heard through your focus groups due to COVID-19?
Yeah, certainly. We actually also had a wonderful paper put together by our colleague Sam Cook that was recently put out. I think it's really important. I think we really started hearing it was in some of the northern ports, right? Some of the accessibility to processing, other things like that. There was, just all of the influences of market demand and/or market shortages. I think what you saw in the larger economy as COVID had impacts was really acute for a lot of these fishermen in terms of like restaurants buying or not buying, how to get their product to market, not having a market when they had product, and then just the general sort of how to react to a global pandemic. It was really, I think, influenced a lot of the initial pieces of this. And again, we started our research in 2019 and had intended to be in person really starting in April of 2020 and had to reconfigure everything to the virtual setting, and we're hitting everybody starting in July. So, we were really at the height of like people's understanding of what would happen and what the pandemic was really, how it was affecting us. And so I think that changed over the course of our virtual setting. By the time we got to March 2021, people's attitudes and things were different. So it varies, I think, across the focus groups.
Mm-hmm. And across commercial versus Cpfvs. I mean, we heard from the Cpfvs, and Jamie can speak to this very eloquently as well, that the Cpfvs, because they had people on their boats more so than the commercial fishermen, they were watching what was happening with the regulations constantly, because there was just so much updating that they had to do. And it was a financial burden because they had such low numbers, but then they had to have such big changes in their protocols, and purchase more water and hand sanitizer and all these things that they couldn't even get their hands on, so that they could at least go out. So there were a lot of those things were captured in the report and in the research too, and more can be added there. And I see that Sam Cook posted in the chat here the link to the paper that John just referenced about the COVID impacts.
Yeah, excellent, Sam. Thank you. Glad you're here.
Yeah, thanks, Sam, for dropping that link. Well, thank you all for your great questions, and thank you, John and Rochelle, for letting us pick your brains. Now I'll turn it over to Steve, who'll give us a brief update on the Mpa Decatal Management Review.
Great, thanks, Lindsay, and fantastic job, John. It's an important aspect for resource management, so we really appreciate it, and I appreciated all the interesting questions as well. If you haven't been following this series, I'm going to touch briefly in the next few minutes why we're having this decadal management review. And as you may know, the network for California was completed in 2012. Following that, the department updated its master plan for marine protected areas from being a siting and planning document to be more of a visionary forward-looking document. So we established a 10-year through that master plan decadal management review process of the network and the management program. The 10-year cycle was based on the life history of the species that are found along California's coastal waters, and it's administratively feasible. We probably wouldn't see much or detect much change in anything less than 10 years. Also, with the updated master plan, we established the Mpa Management Program, which is composed of 4 parts. That's shown here on this slide: outreach and education, research and monitoring, enforcement compliance, and policy and permitting. We're 2022 is the first milestone of the decadal management review, and we are in the process of looking at data that's been collected over the last 10 years and more for each one of these pillars. As we heard today from John in the research and monitoring aspect. All this information is going into a report that we'll be transmitting to the Fish and Game Commission. If you can advance the slide. A report that'll be going to the Fish and Game Commission in February of 2023. It'll include all the monitoring and research that you've been hearing over this series, Ask the Researcher. We've been working with California Native American tribes to better understand traditional ecological knowledge and how that fits into the current management framework. We've been holding meetings with stakeholders to receive input from people like you on the call, fisher people, NGOs, just interested people. All that information is being pulled together as we synthesize this report. We're also working internally with our law enforcement and our fishery scientists to add more information on how the MPAs may or may not be affecting fisheries in California. We were fortunate that the Ocean Protection Council provided funding to activate 3 of its science advisory teams. One team was looking at our action plan, which had performance questions, and it enhanced those questions, drilled down deeper, so we can work, those can be evaluated based on the data that we have. They also formed a group to look at whether or not MPAs could be resilient to climate change. And I think it was Cindy or someone popped in there information about NCES, the National Center for Ecological Assessment and Synthesis. So we're pulling all this information together and we're sharing it with this NCES group that's trying to make connections across all the various habitats that we're targeting, like rocky intertidal, kelp and reef out to 30 meters, or deep water habitat or sand, and pulling in some of this human dimension data. All of this is being pulled together by my team, and with the NCES information, we're probably going to end up with gaps in unknown questions that we hadn't even thought about through this whole process. But we're hopeful that that's going to result in future management strategies that are cost effective moving forward, and some sound adaptive management recommendations that we can take to the commission to consider. It's at this time, the timeline is the report will be publicly available once it's transferred to the commission in January of 2023. And then the commission will officially take receipt of it at their February meeting. At that time, the department will provide a brief overview of the report, the components, and then no action will take place. It's not a regulatory meeting. But in March, the following month, a subgroup of the commission called the Marine Resources Committee will make this a major item for them to have discussions with the department, researchers, everybody that's been involved in this process, and drill down into some of the adaptive management questions and some of the supporting evidence, asking more questions about it. And we're hopeful, I believe the meeting will be like, you won't remember this, I think it's the 16th of March, but like on the 15th of March, we're looking at having a like a public symposium where we'll be discussing each of the 4 pillars of the management program. We'll have our partners that have contributed to management presenting, some of the researchers. We hope they'll be able to be there and share their information. There'll be an open plenary session for discussion, maybe a poster session, but a full day. We're hopeful that decision makers will be there too and can interact with the various people who've been involved in this process. It's a major, major milestone for California. So that's where we are with the timeline. And then the next slide real quickly is, if you have any questions about the planning process, you can go to our landing page that's set up for the Decadal Management Review. I know Rochelle's putting it in the chat for me. That's awesome. And you can check out the components of the program or the parts of the Decadal Management Review. And we have an email address where you can send us a question about the Decadal Review or anything about MPAs. We enjoy it. We try to respond within 48 hours. Usually doesn't take longer than that, so you get a response. And so don't hesitate to reach out with us. And that's my 2-minute drill. I once again want to thank John and everyone who participated on the call. It was a really good, informative presentation. So I'll just pass the mic back to Lindsay.
Thanks, Steve. I just want to say thank you again once more to John and to Rochelle for wearing 2 hats today. We really appreciate all of your presentation and your answers to all the audience questions. Before we hop, I know we're a little late. I just want to advance to the next slide and share our next webinar that's happening in early August 9th. So if you're interested in our estuarine MPAs, please tune back in. So we'll be hearing from Ross Clark and Kevin O'Connor. And there's been a lot of great information shared in the chat. If you have any questions, you can always email us, but there's a lot of great information on CDFW and OPC's website. So with that, I hope you all have a great evening. I'm so glad to spend this past hour with you all.